August 20th, 2004. A date that barely registered in most newsrooms. No war, no election, no scandal. Just a quiet announcement from a company in the north of England. Ilford, one of the oldest names in photographic history, went into receivership. That's the thing, though. It wasn't some obscure outfit nobody had heard of. This was a company founded in 1879. Older than Kodak as a photographic brand. A name that had passed through newspaper darkrooms, hospital X-ray departments, camera bags, and professional labs for well over a century. Earlier that same year, they'd put out a booklet celebrating 125 years of making photographs happen. Then, a few months later, the receivers came in. And that's what makes it so hard to look away. Because this isn't the story of a company that faded quietly. It's the story of a company that was genuinely, historically important, that survived wars and bombings and foreign competition and corporate takeovers, and still ended up on the floor. Kodak would go bankrupt later. Agfa would collapse. But Ilford, in Britain, got there first. Except, and here's the part that keeps the story alive, it didn't quite stay dead. Something survived. A handful of people, working from one remaining factory in Cheshire, decided they weren't finished yet. And what they built out of the wreckage is the reason this story is worth telling at all. Before we get into it, hit subscribe. These are stories about factories, brands, and industries that shaped the modern world. Most of them vanished without anyone really noticing. Ilford almost did. But not quite. The Ilford story doesn't start with a company. It starts with a man pouring emulsion through a teapot in the basement of his house. Alfred Hugh Harman was a photographer. Born in 1841, he'd spent years working with cameras and darkrooms before he made the decision that would change everything. By the late 1870s, photography was beginning to shift. The old wet processes, slow, complicated, best left to professionals with deep pockets and endless patience, were giving way to dry plates. You could manufacture them in advance, store them, sell them, scale them. Harman saw that coming, and in 1879 he moved to Ilford Village, east of London, rented space in a house on Cranbrook Road, and started making dry plates in the basement. The teapot detail has always stuck around in Ilford's own history. And I think that's because it sounds completely wrong for the origin of an industrial empire. A teapot. In a basement. And yet, this is where it begins. Not in a gleaming laboratory. Not with venture capital. Just a man, some chemicals, and the conviction that photography was about to become industrial, and that he could be part of making that happen. Within a few years, the basement phase was over. Demand grew fast enough that Harman built proper manufacturing premises on the same site, the Britannia Works. And sometime in the 1880s, after a split with his early marketing partners, he began selling under the name Ilford. Here's the timing detail that tends to surprise people. The Ilford name entered photographic commerce before Eastman Kodak became Kodak in 1888. One of the oldest names in global photography didn't come from Rochester, New York. It came from a village in Essex. By the end of the 19th century, the basement had become a business and the business had become a company. Harman took it public in the 1890s. Ill health pushed him away from day-to-day control earlier than he'd have liked. But the essential thing was already done. The chemistry had been industrialized. The village had given its name to a brand. And British photography had acquired the manufacturing institution it would rely on for the next 100 years. Once Ilford escaped the basement, it grew with the confidence of a company that knew the world was moving in its direction. Photography wasn't a curiosity anymore, it was becoming a modern necessity. Portrait studios, publishing, science, medicine, record-keeping, and an expanding amateur market that was just beginning to realize it existed. Ilford grew with all of that. Roll film production started in 1912, a crucial shift away from plates and toward the formats that would define 20th century photography. That's not the move of a company clinging to what worked before. That's a company watching the market and responding. Ilford also grew the way successful industrial chemistry firms tend to grow in that era. Through acquisition, consolidation, specialization. By the interwar years, it wasn't just a local success story. It was one of the central names in British photography, with manufacturing across multiple sites, including the Mobberley facility in Cheshire that would eventually become its last great stronghold. This was also when Ilford first had to reckon with Kodak. Kodak had scale, capital, patents, and the full weight of the American market behind it. Ilford, by contrast, was British, independent, and more limited in reach. But it survived. It didn't disappear into Kodak's orbit the way some of its peers did. Whether you read the Kodak approaches as merger proposals or quiet takeover pressure, and historians have disagreed on the details, the broad point stands. Ilford remained Ilford. That preserved something, a genuinely independent British photographic tradition that could have vanished much earlier. What did Ilford actually make? Not just film, in the vague, modern sense. It made the physical substrate of memory. Plates, roll films, papers, chemistry, darkroom systems, specialist materials. Photography, before the digital age, wasn't one product, it was an ecosystem. Whoever controlled the materials controlled the practice. A camera without film and paper was just a beautiful machine that couldn't do its job. Ilford lived in the consumables. And consumables are where industrial power hides. By the first half of the 20th century, Ilford products were flowing into the institutions that documented Britain. The press, the sciences, hospitals, amateur photographers, documentary makers. The company wasn't glamorous, not the way a Leica or a Rolleiflex was glamorous. It was more important than that. It was infrastructure. It sat behind the photograph, not in front of it. Easy to forget. Impossible to replace. War has a way of cutting through the polite surface of a company's history. During peace, a photographic manufacturer sounds almost genteel. Darkrooms, papers, portraits, amateur clubs. During wartime, that softness disappears. Photography becomes reconnaissance. X-ray work. Documentation. Mapping. Intelligence. In the 1940s, Ilford wasn't making charming keepsakes for hobbyists. It was operating inside a national emergency. The war also came directly to the factory. Ilford's works were hit during the Blitz. That's a brief entry in the company's official timeline, but the implications go deeper than damaged brickwork. It means interrupted production, labor strain, supply uncertainty, and the physical vulnerability of an operation that had become nationally important at the exact moment its location was being bombed. And yet Ilford came out of the war not as a relic, but as a more deeply embedded industrial concern. In 1940, while Europe was at war, Ilford introduced multigrade paper, one of the most technically important darkroom innovations in its history. Stop and think about that for a second. The factory is getting bombed and the R&D team is still improving the product line. That's not the behavior of a company in freefall. That's a company that took its work seriously. This matters because later versions of the Ilford story sometimes make the company sound like a passive victim of forces it never could have understood or resisted. That's only part of the truth. For a very long time, Ilford was genuinely good. Not good in the sentimental, heritage brand sense. Good in the hard industrial sense, technically capable, commercially relevant, trusted by professionals under real pressure. Weak companies don't emerge from bombing raids and then set new standards in their field. By 1945, Ilford was still standing. Battered, certainly. Strained, definitely. But alive, modern, and still central to photography's material world. After the war, Ilford did something that makes complete sense emotionally and somewhat questionable sense strategically. It tried to become a camera maker. The result was the Ilford Witness, announced in the late 1940s, remembered today as one of the more fascinating footnotes in British camera history. It wasn't embarrassing because it was cheap or crude. It was embarrassing because it aimed high. It tried to compete in a precision mechanical category where the engineering requirements were completely different from anything Ilford's chemistry expertise could guarantee. Making a fine camera body is a different discipline. You can admire that discipline without automatically possessing it. The Witness ended up as a lesson in what happens when a company confuses competence in one field with natural authority in another. Too much ambition, not enough matched capability, and the camera arrived too late into a market that had moved on. The lesson should have stuck. Because Ilford was about to face a far larger version of exactly the same question. Stay close to what you actually know how to do, or reach for something that looks like the future but might not be yours to claim. In the core black and white materials, meanwhile, the opposite story was playing out. Multigrade paper was maturing into one of the most trusted darkroom product lines in the world. Films like FP4 were building real professional credibility. So the post-war picture is not one of universal drift. In one direction, Ilford misjudged its reach with cameras. In the other, it deepened the categories where it was genuinely formidable. The tension between those two tendencies would define everything that followed. And then came the question that would define the entire second half of the company's life. Color. There are industrial problems you solve by spending more money. There are problems you solve by hiring smarter people. And there are problems that turn out not to be technical dead ends at all. They're strategic trapdoors. For Ilford, color photography became that trapdoor. And here's what's important to understand: Ilford wasn't asleep. It wasn't run by romantics who thought black and white would stay the mass market forever. By 1960, the company had produced its first color negative film, and by 1962 it had process-paid color film in the market. That's the behavior of a company genuinely trying to compete, not one that buried its head. But trying to get into a market and securing a profitable place inside it are two very different things. Color film was brutally difficult, chemically complex, expensive to perfect, and dominated by Kodak's patent power and commercial infrastructure. Ilford had expertise. Kodak had scale in color that dwarfed almost everybody. Then in 1966, the Monopolies Commission stepped in, recommending changes that led to Kodak price reductions and the removal of import duty on color film. In practical terms, that made Ilford's already difficult color position even harder. Take a moment with that. Ilford finally gets into the market that matters most, and then the rules of that market shift in a way that strengthens the foreign giant it was already struggling to match. You can argue endlessly about whether Ilford would have beaten Kodak under better conditions. What you can't seriously argue is that the conditions were fair. Ownership changes tracked the same pressure. ICI took control in 1959. Ciba of Switzerland began acquiring shares in the early 1960s. By 1969, Ciba was sole owner. Those aren't random transactions. They're the kind of structural shifts that happen to a company that's too valuable to leave alone and too constrained to remain comfortably independent. And then, in 1969, Ilford made the decision that would define everything that came after. It left. It withdrew from consumer color film and fell back toward black and white materials and specialist products. On a spreadsheet, you could defend it. Exit an unfavorable market. Concentrate on categories where you can still win. In business school language, it was rational. In historical language, it was fatal. Because once Ilford left mass market color, it surrendered the one battlefield that would determine who controlled everyday photography in the final decades of the 20th century. Kodak stayed. Fuji stayed. Ilford, in effect, stepped aside. Retreat isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's concentration. And for a while, a genuinely long while, Ilford's retreat into black and white looked like exactly the right call. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the company's black and white films, papers, and chemistry didn't merely survive. They became standards. FP4, HP5+, Delta, XP1 and XP2. Multigrade in successive refinements. These weren't nostalgia products. They were working materials that professionals depended on. That distinction matters, because Ilford's black and white dominance has since been romanticized by later generations who rediscovered film long after the fact. But in the period we're talking about, it wasn't retro, it was current. A press photographer could load HP5 and do real, deadline-driven work. A darkroom printer could reach for multigrade because it was efficient, flexible, and reliable. A serious black and white workflow could be built almost entirely inside Ilford's product ecosystem. The company received the Queen's Award for Industry in 1970 and again in 1975. That's not a consolation prize. That's recognition. So why wasn't it enough? Because the category where Ilford was best was slowly, decisively becoming a specialist space. Black and white remained vital, artistically and professionally. It just stopped being the center of mass consumer photography. Families on holiday weren't choosing between FP4 and HP5. They were choosing convenience, speed, color, and eventually 1-hour processing at the high street minilab. The large, everyday market was elsewhere. Ilford's fortress was impressive, but a fortress can still become isolated. There's a subtle structural trap here, too. A specialist product can have high prestige and even strong margins without having the sheer volume needed to sustain a large industrial base indefinitely. Black and white excellence preserved Ilford's reputation. It didn't replace the scale economics of winning consumer color. The company could be admired and still be exposed. And admiration is dangerous, because it can delay the moment when a company recognizes how vulnerable it actually is. By 1983, Ilford had moved its headquarters to Mobberley in Cheshire, concentrating the British operation around the site that would eventually become its last great manufacturing home. From one angle, sensible consolidation. From another, the tightening of a perimeter. Fujifilm didn't rise overnight, and it didn't rise by accident. The 1984 Los Angeles Olympics were a turning point. Fuji was an official sponsor. It supplied film and processing at the venues. It used the games to establish worldwide brand recognition, largely at Kodak's expense. This wasn't simply advertising. It was a declaration that the Japanese challenger was ready to operate on Kodak's terrain, and intended to win. But Fuji did more than market well. It built broadly. Over time, the company treated film not as a sacred identity, not as the thing that defined it forever, but as a base of chemistry, process control, coating expertise, and brand credibility that could be carried into new industries. Healthcare, materials, adjacent technologies. Fuji used what it knew how to do and found other places to do it. This matters for Ilford because Fuji's decisive expansion was happening in exactly the market Ilford had left. Consumer color, mass processing, global visibility, retail ubiquity. Whether Kodak or Fuji won specific battles in that arena is almost beside the point. Ilford wasn't really in the fight anymore. The competitive drama shaping mainstream photography through the 1980s and 1990s was largely passing around Ilford rather than through it. And here's the cruel twist. Ilford's withdrawal from color may have helped it survive the immediate pressures of the 1960s, but it also cut it off from the market that later generated the scale, infrastructure, and consumer presence out of which a digital future could be built. Fuji could pivot because it had spent decades fighting in the large arena, and had accumulated global leverage in the process. Kodak could at least attempt the same thing from the top of that arena. Ilford, by contrast, had preserved the parts of photography that were chemically beautiful and professionally respected, while surrendering the part that was about to become consumer destiny. This is why Ilford's story isn't simply a morality tale about digital disruption. It's also about path dependence. Decisions made under one set of pressures shape what choices are available later. Once Ilford became, in practical terms, a black and white specialist with color out on the edges, it entered the digital age already narrowed. And narrowing can look like discipline, right up until the world changes again. When companies lose strategic clarity, they tend to change hands. Not because the brand is worthless, but because it remains valuable to someone who believes they can extract more from it than the current owner manages to. That's what happened to Ilford. In 1989, the company was sold to International Paper Corporation of America. In 1990, it became part of Ilford Anatech. In 1998, after further restructuring, it came under Doughty Hanson and became Ilford Imaging. That's a remarkable sequence for an institution whose identity had once been so stable, so tied to a specific place, a specific product family, a specific national industrial role. By the end of the 20th century, Ilford was no longer moving through history as a continuous British photographic institution. It was moving through ownership structures. Every one of those transactions could be justified at the time. International Paper had adjacent interests. Doughty Hanson was private equity with a view on asset value and repositioning. None of it was irrational in isolation. The problem is cumulative. A company built on accumulated technical knowledge loses something every time it gets treated primarily as a portfolio component. People leave. Priorities shift. Sites close. Operational memory drains away. And photographic manufacturing, more than outsiders tend to realize, is one of those industries where tacit knowledge matters enormously. The coating line doesn't run only on formulas. It runs on people who know what normal looks like, what wrong looks like, and how to stabilize the process before a defect becomes a catastrophe. That kind of knowledge doesn't transfer in a sale document. It lives in people, and people move on. The site story tells the same tale in physical form. The move to Mobberley. The closure of older operations. The Brentwood Cello Works sold for housing in the 1990s. These aren't just real estate events, they're symptoms. They tell you the company is shrinking, rationalizing, moving inward. A giant national manufacturer becoming one remaining stronghold. From a distance, the 1990s still allowed for hope. Film still sold. Darkrooms still functioned. Digital cameras hadn't yet annihilated consumer habits. It was still possible to believe the brand would bridge the next transition. But hope alone cannot undo structural narrowing. And the market was about to be hit by something far faster and more total than most incumbents had prepared for. The year 2004 should have been a celebration. Ilford put out a commemorative booklet marking 125 years of photographic manufacturing, linking the present business all the way back to Harman's basement in 1879. The tone was proud, and deservedly so. There was a legitimate heritage there. A real story worth telling. The trouble is that heritage doesn't pay creditors. On August 20, 2004, Ilford Imaging UK Limited went into receivership. The British arm failed. The Swiss operations were simultaneously put into their own administration and sale processes. The anniversary and the collapse fell in the same year. That juxtaposition is so brutal it barely needs embellishment. One moment, the company was publishing celebratory history. The next, it was another casualty of an industry being dismantled by digital photography. It's tempting to compress the explanation into one sentence: digital killed film. But that's too easy, and too flattering to the management decisions that preceded it. Digital was the executioner, yes. It wasn't the whole illness. Ilford reached 2004 already compromised, by decades of ownership changes, by the long consequences of leaving the consumer color market in 1969, by the structural fragility of being strongest in a specialist segment while the market's largest volumes went elsewhere. Digital hit everybody in the industry. It destroyed Ilford in Britain because Ilford no longer had enough strategic room to absorb the blow. The broader industry context confirms the scale of the crisis. Fujifilm would later describe the collapse in film demand as industry-wide and severe enough to force complete business model transformation. Kodak would eventually enter Chapter 11. Agfa's consumer arm collapsed. So Ilford wasn't alone. But others' suffering doesn't erase the specific tragedy here. Because Ilford wasn't just another photographic company. It was one of the foundational names of the medium in Britain. One that had made it from photography's industrial childhood all the way to its digital old age. A factory that had once represented continuity now represented uncertainty. Workers who knew how to make film and paper and chemistry at a high level found themselves inside insolvency logic. Assets could be sold. Buildings repurposed. Trademarks divided. And once those things happen, heritage fragments very quickly. The old idea that a famous name protects you disappears. A famous name can be carved up just as easily as an unknown one. Sometimes more easily, because it still has market value. This is where the story becomes improbable. Not miraculous. Not sentimental. Just improbable. In February 2005, 6 former managers of Ilford Imaging UK formed a new company, Harman Technology. The name was deliberate. It honored Alfred Harman, the 19th-century founder, and signaled continuity with the older Ilford tradition, even as the corporate structure that had surrounded that tradition had collapsed entirely. The purpose was stated plainly: keep black and white film photography alive, operating from Mobberley, trading as Ilford Photo. The key thing about this rescue is what it wasn't. It wasn't an attempt to rebuild a mass-market photographic empire. It wasn't built on the fantasy that the old world was coming back. 6 people looked at what remained after the collapse and made a clear-eyed decision about what could actually survive. They accepted that the age of universal film photography was over. And they built a business for the age that came after. There were costs. The Ilford name itself became divided, black and white rights remaining with Harman under license while other parts of the brand moved separately through Switzerland and other structures. The old unified Ilford ceased to exist. What survived was a crucial part of it, not the whole thing. This isn't resurrection in the romantic sense. It's salvage. And salvage can be enough. Harman acquired Kentmere in 2007, widened its position in lower-cost black and white products, and steadily re-established itself as a serious British manufacturer that hadn't accepted extinction as the default answer. The strategic logic was sound: broaden the range, preserve the premium Ilford identity, and create entry points for a newer generation of users who were beginning, slowly, unexpectedly, to find their way back to film. The empire was gone. The mass market was gone. The unified trademark was gone. But the coating know-how wasn't gone. The black and white product culture wasn't gone. The Mobberley site was still there. And enough people remained who understood that photography manufacturing isn't a brand management exercise. It's a process discipline. Harman's survival wasn't built on nostalgia alone. Nostalgia gets you attention. It does not keep coating machines running. What kept Harman alive was that it found a way to become the right size for a smaller but real market, and then found that the market wasn't actually finished. Film hadn't returned as the default mass medium. That era is genuinely over. But it had returned as a chosen medium. Younger photographers began discovering film not as a memory but as a deliberate alternative. Darkroom work stopped looking obsolete and started looking distinctive. The physicality of the process, exposure, development, print, grain, tonal control, the delay between pressing the shutter and seeing the result, stopped being a defect and became a reason to participate. By the early 2020s, Harman was describing itself as a 200-person operation at Moberly, shipping to more than 80 countries and investing in modernization. That's the language of expansion, not hospice care. And then came the symbolic reversal that nobody in 2004 would have thought remotely likely. Color film. In Britain. From Moberly. In late 2023, Harman launched Phoenix 200, its first color film fully manufactured at the Moberly site. The company described it as experimental, high contrast, grainy, and unapologetically characterful. That description matters, because Phoenix wasn't introduced as a polished imitation of Kodak or Fuji. It was introduced as a new British-made color film with its own distinct look, built by a company that had once left consumer color because the economics made staying there nearly impossible. That doesn't erase 1969. It doesn't erase receivership. It doesn't restore the unified Ilford empire. But it does turn the entire arc of the story into something richer than straight-line decline. The company that lost color found a way back into color. Not as the same business. Not under the same conditions. Not with the same ambitions. But back. So what, finally, is the Ilford story? It's not simply the story of a British company defeated by American and Japanese rivals, though that's part of it. It's not simply the story of digital photography destroying film, though that's part of it too. It's not even just the story of a great old brand saved by loyal insiders who refused to let it die, though that also happened. The full story is more uncomfortable and more useful than any of those simplified versions. Ilford shows what happens when a company can be brilliant in product, serious in chemistry, culturally central to a medium, and still lose control of its future because the key market moves elsewhere. It shows how rational decisions can compound into strategic disaster. Exiting consumer color in 1969 was defensible in the narrow sense. So were the later ownership sales. So was the restructuring and site consolidation. None of those decisions, taken individually, sounds insane. Together, they narrowed the company until digital could hit a target that no longer had enough room to move. But it also shows the opposite lesson. Survival after collapse is possible when the survivors stop pretending the old world is coming back and start building for the world that actually exists. Harman technology didn't save Ilford by trying to revive the 20th century. It saved part of Ilford by accepting the 21st. It kept the coatings, the papers, the black and white expertise, the manufacturing intelligence, the one site capable of continuing the work. That's why Ilford survived as a living practice rather than a heritage logo slapped on unrelated products. And that's why the last image in this story shouldn't be a bankruptcy notice. It should be something smaller and more stubborn. A roll of HP5 being loaded into a camera by someone born long after the receivers came in. A box of multi-grade paper opened in a darkroom by somebody who never knew the era when every high-street minilab was busy. A roll of Phoenix 200 being shot by a photographer who has no memory of Ilford leaving color in 1969, and therefore no reason to treat its return as anything except present tense. The basement is gone. The teapot is gone. The old empire is gone. But the chemistry is still running. And for a company like Ilford, that's about as close to immortality as industry ever gets.